My previous video, where I discussed how journalists linked to the Russian pro-religious organization Ratseers use covert influence techniques in their publications to create lone wolves programmed to go and kill politicians, caused quite a stir and surprised many people. But let me ask you, why are you surprised? Excuse me? But who still doesn't realize that a number of media outlets deliberately manipulate our minds? Who doesn't see that? While there are adequate, normal media simply reporting on events, there are others, really crazy ones, that distort reality and infect people with the poison of hatred and aggression, sowing fear and division in society? Well, in fact, they aren't crazy. They make us crazy. By bombarding us with streams of lies, disinformation, and negativity, they create a toxic informational environment that literally poisons our psyche. After watching the news, people experience skyrocketing stress and anxiety. They even develop heart and nervous system problems. It's impossible to remain mentally healthy and balanced while immersed in such an environment for a long time. And who hasn't felt this personally? So, these aggressive, crazy media that pit people against one another and destroy everything in their path can only be described as anti-human. Such media are saturated with manipulation techniques as clearly demonstrated by the results of their work. Their methods go beyond mere unprofessionalism. They constitute deliberate psychological programming. Who doesn't see that? Only those who are so deeply coded by those media that they perceive the hatred being spread as normal. Those people who lost their ability to critically assess information, verify it on their own, double-check it, seek evidence, and consider alternative perspectives. Such people become suggestible and easily controlled. And it is precisely from this group of manipulated individuals that so-called lone wolves are recruited. People who, under the influence of media manipulation, commit attacks on politicians. These are not isolated incidents. They represent the outcome of carefully orchestrated, covert informational and psychological operations designed to remotely condition individuals to commit crimes. The example I gave of the assassination attempt on Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico is just the tip of the iceberg. There are actually many similar cases, but the problem is that such incidents are treated as isolated tragic events in various countries, with no attention paid to the strikingly similar circumstances and patterns that clearly point to a link between those events and the distinctive style of a single orchestrator. Yet if you look closely, you'll see that the first and main common feature of all these attacks is a preceding long and carefully planned media campaign to discredit the victim. Moreover, those campaigns involve anti-cult or dehumanizing Nazi rhetoric and a wide spectrum of manipulative techniques, ranging from the primitive to sophisticated methods of covert behavioral coding. What's especially alarming is that politicians targeted by those campaigns naively attribute them to the actions of their political opponents, thereby overlooking a far more global threat. This mistake has proven fatal for many people. In reality, there is a much more powerful force behind these attacks, a force with significant international influence. Ultimately, all threads lead in one direction: the Russian pro-religious organization Ratseers and its leader, Alexander Dvorkin. To support my claims, let me provide a few examples. Certain anti-cultists who follow my videos, for reasons that are clear, have criticized me for being overly emotional. Fine. Today, let's stick to the facts. Let's take the case I already mentioned, the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, then a candidate for the U.S. presidency. As you may recall, Trump narrowly escaped with his life, sustaining a wound to his ear. This attack came almost immediately, just months after the attempt on Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico. Similarities between the two incidents are so striking that even Fico remarked on them in a Facebook post, noting that the attack on Trump followed almost a copycat scenario. In both cases, a mechanism of mass informational conditioning, well tested by rat seers, was launched through controlled media long before the attacks. Those supposedly independent outlets systemically injected subliminal implants in the public consciousness, aimed at inciting division and fostering hatred toward the targets. In the lead-up to Trump's assassination attempt, anti-cultists and their media agents actively demonized and dehumanized him, branding him as a cult leader and his supporters as cultists, meaning sectarians. As early as in 2019, American anti-cultist Stephen Hesson formally engaged in deprogramming. That involved abducting individuals and subjecting them to psychological and physical abuse for profit. Published his book, The Cult of Trump. There he employed the manipulative tactic of guilt by association, comparing Trump to figures like Jim Jones, David Koresh, Ron Hubbard, and Sun Myung Moon, individuals whom anti-cultists have long portrayed as leaders of dangerous, destructive cults. Hesson went even further, claiming that all Americans who supported Trump were members of a cult, who, according to Hesson, were in a state of hypnotic submission and unaware of their own actions. Such claims carry an implicit message that Trump supporters are no longer free-thinking individuals, but brainwashed followers incapable of critical thought or objective assessment of their leader. Moreover, Hesson portrayed Trump as a narcissistic leader who cared about no one but himself. To make it clear for you, this wasn't just another book about Trump by an obscure author. At some point, the anti-cult narratives propagated by Hesson and other anti-cultists were picked up and actively promoted by leading American media outlets, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others. Moreover, Hesson, the author of The Cult of Trump, suddenly became a sought-after guest on major American TV channels. There he confidently and persistently spread key dehumanizing narratives about Trump and his supporters. Somehow, Hesson even managed to appear on CNN as an expert, openly advocating for the forced deprogramming of American citizens. He suggested that worldviews of Americans need to be forcibly altered because, as he claims, Donald Trump has already negatively influenced the entire nation. And the fact is that all of America needs deprogramming because Donald Trump has negatively influenced all of us. If we dig just a little bit deeper and look at the facts that are in plain sight, it becomes clear that anti-cultist Steve Hesson is not only connected to other anti-cultists in the USA, but also in Europe and Russia. In particular, a number of facts point to his ties with rat seers, which is covered in detail in the Impact documentary, so you can watch it and see it for yourselves. Now tell me, how is it possible for one anti-cultist to exert such significant influence without substantial backing and solid funding from someone highly interested in propagating the demonizing narratives about Trump to the masses? Clearly, such a sustained, targeted campaign must be supported by a powerful third party. And here's another question. If this rhetoric is harmless, why is so much effort being made to amplify narratives on major media platforms about Trump's supposed cultishness? The goal is obvious: to foster a negative perception of Trump and his supporters within American society, portraying them as a threat and subhumans. That must be eliminated. This type of dehumanizing rhetoric was widely used by the Nazis against the Jewish population in the past, ultimately leading to a horrific genocide and the deaths of millions of innocent people. This kind of rhetoric inevitably results in violence against a labeled victim, which is perceived as justified and acceptable by those infected with the virus of hate. Don't you see clear parallels? And this is just referencing the Nazi manipulation techniques, directly adopted by anti-cultists from Nazi ideologists, like Walter Koenig. Add to this more advanced methods of behavior programming, employed by modern ideologists from raciers and their agents, and it becomes apparent that the assassination attempt on Trump was a predictable outcome of such a demonizing media campaign. In this case, as part of their global strategy, to methodically destabilize the United States from within, ideologists from raciers found it more advantageous. If Trump did not become a president, why? Because despite all his controversies, Trump represents an uncontrollable variable in their meticulously calculated plan. Especially given that Trump, a staunch proponent of genuine democracy, became a victim of their manipulative technologies himself. His unpredictability and determination to uphold democratic principles poses a direct threat to the plans of Ratzier's ideologists, aimed at establishing shadow control over American society. In this context, the attempt on Trump's life was not just an isolated act of political violence, but a demonstration of how catastrophically vulnerable democracy is when faced with the threat of neo-Nazism revived by Russian anti-cultists from raciers. They have already turned the U.S. political arena into a battleground for informational warfare. Under the guise of advocating free speech, they are systematically destroying foundations of democracy, sowing chaos, and deepening divisions among Americans. Do you think the facts I presented are mere coincidences? Then let's look at another example: the assassination of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2022. Let me remind for those who are unfamiliar with these events that Abe was killed by a lone gunman, a term favored by anti-cultists. The shooter later justified his actions by claiming hatred for the former prime minister due to his alleged support for the Unification Church, also known as the Moonies. However, actual facts debunk these accusations. In reality, Abe had only sent video messages to 2 events hosted by an organization legally independent from the Moonies, but connected to them through common founders. Moreover, Abe was merely one among many global leaders who sent records of their speeches to the events of this organization, including Donald Trump. This highlights a standard practice of diplomatic engagement. It is obvious that the shooter's bias against the Moonies and anything associated with them was preconditioned by the influence of anti-cult propaganda which was actively disseminated by Japanese anti-cultists. A local anti-cult organization that emerged in the 1980s is part of a global anti-cult network, closely collaborating with American and Spanish anti-cultists. Most notably, they have ongoing cooperation with the French anti-cult organization FECRIS, that operates under the direct influence of Russia's Red Sears. On top of that, Abe's assassin harbored deep hatred for the Moonies because they allegedly bankrupted his mother, who had made significant donations to the organization. However, she made donations back in 2002, yet he decided to act 2 decades later. Why? What explains such a delayed reaction? And why did he aim his hatred specifically at a prominent politician? Let's carefully analyze the shooter's actions, and you will see clear signs of remote programming of his consciousness. According to media reports, the attacker had previously test-fired his weapon at the former Unification Church building. Later, he told the police that he had initially intended to kill the church leader, possibly Mrs. Moon herself, but since it was technically difficult, he instead killed Abe, who turned out to have no connection to the church. Now tell me, does this kind of approach to selecting a target look like a conscious, deliberate action? No. This kind of behavior is a result of remote programming. It explains why he acted 20 years after his mother's alleged bankruptcy due to the Moonies. What is really striking is that the day before the assassination, the shooter actively engaged on social media with other Unification Church haters who were also involved in anti-cult propaganda. Here we can see a classic scheme of manipulative programming. The shooter's existing personal grudge served as an entry point for professional manipulators if his deed were solely motivated by the shooter's personal desire for revenge. He would not have waited 20 years. Moreover, he would have chosen a different target, but he didn't. This indicates the involvement of an external influence, someone who skillfully nurtured and amplified his hatred, using covert techniques of psychological conditioning, which ultimately transformed an ordinary man into a lone wolf with a clearly assigned target. The proof of manipulation lies in the very mechanics of what happened. It wasn't a spontaneous act of revenge, but the result of a carefully planned operation to program his subconsciousness. The shooter's predisposition and personal trauma were merely convenient entry points for manipulators who specialize in turning individuals into killers. The same manipulators later glorify such shooters, creating new images for further covert impact, as seen in cases like Columbine and similar incidents. The involvement of anti-cultists in Abe's assassination is further evidenced by subsequent developments. After Shinzo Abe's murder, mass media launched an unprecedentedly aggressive and cynical campaign against the Unification Church. Instead of condemning the killer or investigating the role of anti-cult propaganda in his radicalization, certain media outlets affiliated with anti-cultists began blaming the Unification Church itself, alleging that it bore responsibility for the crime. This tactic of swapping the roles of victim and perpetrator is a classic example of high-level manipulative techniques frequently employed by anti-cultists. To cover their trails, and anti-cultists actively promoted a narrative that it was exactly the Unification Church that provoked the shooter's actions. Through their controlled media outlets, they created a distorted reality where the victim became the ultimate perpetrator and an evil entity. Using the chaos they themselves had created, anti-cultists started lobbying for new laws and advocating for the establishment of an organization similar to UNADFI, a French anti-cult entity that receives state funding, allegedly to support victims of cults. As a result of this orchestrated campaign, the Japanese government enacted new laws against so-called cults, directly affecting the Unification Church. The victims of this manipulative anti-cult campaign were innocent church members and their families who faced a wave of threats, violence, and hatred fueled by the media. Members of the Unification Church, including children, faced widespread harassment, death threats, persecution, and bullying at schools and workplaces. Often threatening phone calls began with phrases like, "I saw it on the news," or "I heard it on TV," vividly illustrating how hate-filled media rhetoric initiated by anti-cultists incites violence. Those individuals, professionally manipulated into believing that the media doesn't lie, genuinely thought they had a right to commit acts of violence. Moreover, the wave of hatred and anti-cult hysteria extended to not only the Unification Church, but Jehovah's Witnesses too, who also faced attacks. This is a classic example of how professional manipulators can turn reality upside down, transforming victims into perpetrators and positioning the true culprits as fighters for justice. The informational and psychological operation carried out by Japanese anti-cultists, linked to Fekris and correspondingly to Rat's ears, resulted in radicalization of society, driven by disinformation and manipulation. Shinzo Abe's murder fractured Japanese society so quickly and deeply that even his funeral was accompanied by mass protests. This is how the network of Rat Sears ideologists operates, who under the guise of anti-cult activity aim to destabilize nations, deepen societal divisions, polarize society, and sow chaos. There are numerous similar cases of political assassination attempts and murders. When someone seeks psychological help, acknowledging that something's wrong with them, but then commits an act of violence against a politician the next day, it's a clear indication that this person was subjected to behavioral programming and subconscious conditioning. When an armed individual aimlessly wanders through a city, but ends up precisely where a well-known politician is, and murders them, that's another sign of such coding. When shooters justify their actions with claims of hatred towards politicians, blaming them for all their problems, these are also indicators of coding. And the list can go on. Actually, the behavior of many attackers exhibited characteristic features of post-hypnotic suggestion, particularly a narrowed, tunnel-like state of consciousness. They are not mere schizophrenics. Those individuals were initially mentally healthy, but were subjected to intensive psychological influence, leading them to carry out commands implanted in their subconsciousness by manipulators. Psychologists and psychiatrists may claim such methods are impossible, arguing that it's impossible to remotely compel someone to commit murder. However, they say this out of fear that someone will expose these techniques and start manipulating others. But as long as such specialists, who supposedly care about citizen safety, deny this phenomenon, Rat Sears agents successfully continue to remotely guide people. Like missiles towards a target, and assassination attempts persist. So what kind of safety can we talk about? Put anyone in a hypnotic state, Give them a weapon and give a command, and they will carry it out. This is known to any professional familiar with hypnosis and suggestion techniques. There is a belief that if a person has well-developed critical thinking, they are not susceptible to hypnosis, suggestion, or similar manipulations. However, in the case of remote programming, critical thinking is of no help because those methods bypass the critical barrier of consciousness, directly influencing a person's subconsciousness. Moreover, inducing a trance state in a person is not a difficult process, particularly when special methods of influence are applied. Anyone familiar with this field will confirm that what I'm saying is absolutely feasible. So why is the obvious still being denied? For what purpose? To allow someone to continue their dirty deeds? I now address psychologists and psychiatrists, especially those who are into this topic, or may have even conducted experiments on remote suggestion. Please confirm, do such methods exist or not? Is it possible to remotely program a person to carry out a specific action or not? The problem is that no one has yet conducted a comparative analysis of similar attempts on politicians, where the so-called lone wolves were involved. No one is studying where this hatred came from or who cultivated it. Countries are different. Languages and political situations are different. But manipulation methods used by the media are always the same, and the result is always the same. Destabilization of society, division, polarization, and ultimately, generation of controlled chaos, which benefits organizers of such attacks. The same patterns appear everywhere, always beginning with a discrediting campaign in mass media. Yes, allegedly opposition-aligned outlets or political opponents of the victims may be involved in this process. But who stands behind these opponents? And why do the informational terror attacks, using dehumanizing anti-cult rhetoric, escalate to such a level? If you follow the threads in every case, you will find the same key players and manipulators behind the informational and psychological operations. Moreover, mass media and their individual representatives will be invariably connected both to one another and to those manipulators. Thus, we can see that all the threads ultimately lead to Dworkin. Knowing the overall scheme of actions and closely following the political media landscape, you'll begin to recognize the distinctive style of the professional manipulators who orchestrate such attacks. When media headlines label a politician as a cult leader, refer to their supporters as a cult in his name, or claim that he has supposedly turned the country into one giant cult. These are clear markers of manipulation and signs of an active operation. Moreover, the Rat Sears anti-cult network employs these tools not only to organize physical attacks, but also to destroy reputations of politicians. Their ultimate goal is to eliminate undesirable political figures by any means available. A striking example is the recent anti-cult campaign against Moldovan President Maia Sandu. Similar headlines once targeted Alexei Navalny in Russia. These are classic demonstrations of how such techniques are used by Rat Sears network to influence political processes and manipulate public opinion. What's alarming is the fate of politicians subjected to such dehumanization by anti-cultists. And the most concerning thing is that, at the early stages, most of them are unaware of how dangerous the process is. Because where today there are only insulting labels, tomorrow there will be persecution, and the day after tomorrow there will be physical violence. It's also important to note that Ratzier's agents adapt their rhetoric to local contexts. The terms cult or sect may not always be explicitly used. However, methods remain the same. Dehumanizing rhetoric targeting a certain politician, portraying him or her as enemy, who is supposedly dividing society, who is dangerous, or who is destroying the country, and so on. It will all be done by the same people who, when investigated, are found to be linked to Ratziers. The manipulative techniques used to sway the masses would also be identical, even if the markers of cult or sect are omitted. And the outcome will remain unchanged if they set themselves such a goal, namely elimination of a certain politician from the political stage and emergence of the so-called lone wolves. These are not isolated incidents, but parts of a global strategy by Ratzier's ideologists, where each case is merely the visible tip of a broader operation to reshape political landscapes. By learning to identify these schemes, you can anticipate events long before they reach their peak. The examples I mentioned, including the attacks on Fitzo, Trump, and Shinzo Abe, highlight just how actively and aggressively Ratzier's agents interfered and continue to interfere in elections and the political processes in various countries, pushing their interests in achieving their objectives. If you look around, you'll see the scale of their operations and recognize that their interference is evident in many countries. Wherever they operate, that they create chaos and confrontation. There are also many cases where people influenced by media manipulation and filled with hatred and dissatisfaction attack politicians in mobs. There are countless examples of individuals in crowds throwing mud or paint at politicians, and so on. Such acts are often committed by people with labil psyche who are easily suggestible. Why do they do that? After all, they don't personally know the politician, nor do they know anything about their life. And their understanding of the politician's work is limited to the narratives provided by the media channels they frequently watch or the newspapers they regularly read. People act this way because they are manipulated, although they are unaware of that. Such mob attacks occur far more often than lone attacks because personal responsibility dissipates in a crowd, making it easier to manipulate. A crowd can be more easily incited, infected with hatred, and directed towards aggression as desired by the manipulator against a specific political figure. While orchestrating individual attacks is technically more complex, these methods are also being refined, for instance, through school shootings and mass shootings. Take a closer look, and you'll be horrified at how such incidents are actually orchestrated. After a new school shooting incident, investigate the surrounding schools and neighborhoods. You'll discover a sudden surge in bipolar disorders among children and teenagers. Why does such a mass epidemic arise? As I've mentioned before, bipolar disorder is an inevitable consequence of remote behavioral programming, as it involves violent interference with human subconsciousness. Naturally, this leaves psychological scars on those ensnared in such informational coding. Speak with those children, and you'll be shocked to learn how many teenagers have entertained similar thoughts of carrying out mass shootings in both the affected school and neighboring ones. So all of your doubts about the spontaneity of such events will vanish like smoke. It will become clear to you that the narrative of a lone wolf inspired by Columbine videos is a simplistic explanation of a complex, orchestrated process. The reality is far grimmer. Before every new school shooting, countless people entertain similar thoughts And many students meticulously plan violent scenarios in their minds. What's especially alarming is the rapid escalation in the use of these methods. That's why I said and will say again that these methods employed by rat-seers agents are more terrifying than the weapons of mass destruction. Their outcomes are worse than the radiation aftermath of a nuclear explosion. To give you a sense of the true scale of violence against politicians, let me share some statistics. The scale of violence against politicians is evident in Germany. In just 1 year, from 2022 to 2023, crimes targeting politicians increased by a staggering 183%. These figures not only highlight a pan-European trend, but also underscore a growing crisis. In various countries, such pressure and threats are prompting potential candidates to withdraw from political life, while active politicians are prematurely ending their careers. All of this points to the fact that violence against politicians has become a systemic phenomenon that threatens the very foundations of free democratic societies. The situation in the United States also reveals a disturbing surge in violence. Over the last 8 years, threats against members of Congress have increased nearly tenfold, from 800 incidents to 8,000. Here I've only stated the facts about high-ranking politicians. An even more frightening reality is at the level of U.S. states. Recent studies have shown that over 40% of state officials and politicians faced direct threats or attacks in the past 3 years. Furthermore, 90% of politicians, think about that, 90%, reported experiencing violence in various forms, including harassment, intimidation, and stalking. Such a sharp rise in violence has spurred a wave of academic research. Scholars wondered, why is this happening in democratic societies? How did we reach a point where 1 in 5 Americans now considers violence against politicians to be acceptable? When did we cross the horrifying line where violence shifted from being taboo to becoming a legitimate option? Some researchers argue that present-day violence against politicians is fundamentally different from what we saw in the past. They claim that radicalization now often happens online. Criminals are turned into extremists through internet communication. In other words, a person can sit alone at home, but through the screen of their computer, they can be manipulated into a state where they are willing to commit acts of violence. Other researchers point to the emergence of groups that intentionally foster societal chaos as the root cause of this rising violence. Why do those groups specifically target politicians? According to experts, politicians symbolize order and stability in society, and that's what extremists seek to dismantle. Thus, their goal isn't merely to attack individuals, but to provoke unrest and collapse of the system as a whole. Doesn't the description of these extremist groups remind you of anyone? It is worth noting that overall, the aforesaid studies accurately describe the situation, but fail to answer the main question. Who is really behind that? And why is it all being done? Researchers often limit their focus to their own countries, which prevents them from seeing the true cause. They are like blind men touching parts of an elephant and unable to perceive the whole animal. Meanwhile, the situation is crystal clear. Look at the nature of the attacks on politicians. Those are not random acts by deranged loners, but part of a meticulously organized campaign. The same methods, interconnected perpetrators, and always the presence of rat-seers agents behind them. The goal of such surges of violence is obvious: to polarize society and trigger conflict. That is why the violently targeted politicians are not chosen randomly. An attack on one of them creates a prolonged resonance in society, much like a ringing bell. The strategy of anti-cultists, this very third force, is simple. The more frequently the bell tolls, the more people gather to its ringing. An attack on one politician, then another attack on another politician, and now two groups of people gather who support different politicians and are burning with hatred towards each other. They stand face to face and are ready to destroy each other because they've already been indoctrinated by various subconscious manipulations that society is divided into friends and foes. In such a situation, all it takes is a little push to provoke a conflict. Only a blind man cannot see that. The growing number of attacks on politicians is due to the fact that those groups controlled by race-seers agents are gaining power, increasing the number of agents and approaching their main goal: to create a huge discord in society, which can eventually lead to armed conflict. Selection of individual politicians as targets is never coincidental. The higher the potential of a politician to unite a fractured society, the more likely they are to find themselves in the crosshairs. That's no coincidence. It's a strategy. Any leader capable of restoring national unity automatically becomes a target. Because such a figure poses the greatest threat to those who thrive on societal division. Let's look at what happened in the United States over the last 30 years. During this period, several alarming trends escalated. Politicians were increasingly attacked, and the number of mass shootings increased. At the same time, the Russian pro-religious organization Ratseers was growing stronger and more powerful. Democratic Europe has also witnessed an unprecedented surge in aggression against politicians. What was once considered an anomaly has now become a grim reality. However, these isolated crimes are merely the tip of the iceberg. Behind every such attack, there is a vast system of continuous targeted pressure. From orchestrated social media harassment campaigns against specific politicians to their physical persecution. All of this amplifies the atmosphere of hatred, benefiting Ratseers agents. For instance, a well-known British MP revealed that due to severe safety threats and immense psychological pressure, some of his colleagues from all British political parties had contemplated suicide. Behind these stark facts stand real human tragedies. As participants of Allatra, we know firsthand what it means to live under unbearable pressure because we too have become victims of Ratseers' dehumanizing attacks. We know what it feels like when authorities break into our homes early in the morning, terrifying our families. We know what it's like to live in constant fear, facing threats against ourselves and our children, and watching our friends being tortured and harassed. We know this because we've been enduring this for 10 years. So, we empathize with politicians who cannot withstand this pressure. They are merely individuals trying to work honestly for their countries, yet all they get in return are threats, attacks on their families, and a life of perpetual fear. It's an insurmountable burden. The UK example highlights another critical point. Today, representatives of all political affiliations are under attack, regardless of their agenda or party affiliation. Therefore, what we are witnessing isn't just a rise in violence or mental disorders. It's a deliberate, persistent attack by rat seers and its agents on society as a whole. These orchestrators are gradually destroying social bonds and eroding trust among people. And the consequences are growing increasingly dire. The shadow third force employs techniques of manipulation over mass consciousness to create the chaos we currently witness as it dominates global politics and economics. The threat isn't limited to the well-being of individual citizens. The very existence of a unified democratic society is at risk. Now you can see for yourselves that these methods of manipulation aren't simply fighting against cults. Anti-cultism is merely a facade, a cover for the true objectives of a globally coordinated rat seers agent network. I would also like to comment on another point. Ever since the truth began to come to light, some rat seers agents started masking their fear with public bravado, dismissing the claims as a new conspiracy theory about the anti-cultist deep state. But let's pose a few simple questions, the answers to which should be obvious to anyone who's able to think logically. How else can you explain the fact that the same rhetoric and strategy for eliminating politicians are used across different countries? Why are the same methods applied? Why are all transmitters of anti-cult rhetoric, whether journalists, bloggers, politicians, or even a country president, interconnected and ultimately linked to rat seers? Why do journalists, who are in non-stop conflict with existing authorities and who label politicians as sectarians, maintain close ties with one another, copy each other's articles, and exchange secret manipulation tactics? Who covers them? Try publishing an article with similar rhetoric, and you will face countless problems. Yet they regularly publish demonizing and stinging pieces on political topics, and no one has any claims against them. Why? Has anyone seriously investigated the sources of their funding? Who ordered those articles? Within just 3 weeks, 400 publications have been released about Alatra alone. Who gave money for that? Have you seen journalists who work for free, moreover, with a risk to face criminal charges? Have you ever seen such suicides? What is their motivation? And here's the most interesting question. If they are so free and independent, and if they act without common management and center of coordinating their activities, why do they defend each other so vigorously, especially when one of them is exposed? After all, we observed it so many times that when one of those journalists is threatened with exposure or criminal prosecution, the entire network, all those who regularly transmit anti-cult rhetoric and use Nazi methods of manipulation, instantly become active and start yelling about oppression of freedom of speech. The reason for this solidarity is simple and clear. They realize that the first successful precedent of exposure will mark a beginning of the ultimate end for their entire network. As soon as relevant authorities uncover the activities of one link in the chain, they will inevitably start checking all the others. That is why they are so desperate in their attempts to protect each other. It's a matter of survival, while their hysterical reaction to denunciation of their action scheme is the best proof that we have hit the nail on the head. What I'm saying is not a conspiracy theory. It is simply logic and a call for a clear and honest examination of the situation. It won't be difficult for competent authorities to verify this, and it's the primary thing that needs to be done right now. What we face today is far more serious and dangerous. It's a third force with a vested interest that covertly interferes in the state order of various countries and uses identical manipulative methods to influence mass consciousness with regard to various social groups, whether religious or secular, as well as with regard to politicians. They don't strike directly, but manipulate others to attack and kill. They turn people into weapons and then direct them like missiles at targets. It would be more correct to say that within the entire Ratseers network, there are clear divisions, the so-called lower and upper leagues. The lower league thrives on the most primitive, yet still effective dehumanizing narratives. They are obsessed with fighting cults and sex. Buzzwords like dangerous sex, violence, occult rituals, or expressions like they want to commit mass suicide. The Waco case is a classic example of what destructive activities of such a lower league of Ratseers agents results in. Although it's a lower one, it has inflicted incredible grief to millions of people. You can read more about that on websites of independent journalists. But what about the upper league? That's exactly where their global ambitions are. They attack politicians, skillfully and artfully build discrediting campaigns against them, stigmatize and dehumanize them. They use similar but slightly modified rhetoric, as in the case of those groups they brand as sex and cults, and masterfully implant a negative image of a specific politician into the minds of the masses, forcing people to think the way Ratseers agents want them to think. The only people who do not succumb are those who retain critical thinking and, as sane individuals, have a natural reaction like, "Who on earth would believe that?" However, a certain part of people with a label psyche, who have already been puzzle-coded and brainwashed by anti-cultists, will believe it. And they don't need much more than that. It's a tiny percentage, but it creates such a stir that it splits society. Thus, when a politician is successfully dehumanized in the eyes of the public and his authority is undermined, the lower league gets involved and starts howling like a pack of street dogs. Consequently, at best, the politician gets out of the race, while in the worst case, people start attacking him in the streets, because this way, Ratseers agents stir up hatred. Or there appear lone wolves for whom those very agents artificially set a target, a politician undesirable to them. They aim to dehumanize politicians not only in order to block certain individuals from coming to power, who might obstruct their goals, but also to recruit new agents among them, using those recruits for introducing laws that undermine the country's democratic system. Ratseers and the whole network under its control not only interfere in elections in various countries, influence politicians and their rhetoric, but also can create riots and discords, influencing consciousness of the masses. Politicians are forced to follow their lead in order to maintain their status and power. This is how the allegedly anti-sectarian and anti-cult laws are pushed through, which Ratseers' accomplices cover in the wrapper of protecting society from threat. Meanwhile, under the allegedly plausible pretext, people are actually deprived of their legal democratic rights, and the very essence of democracy is gradually collapsing. Look what results they have already achieved in various countries. We've already seen what their activities caused in Ukraine. Right now, we are witnessing how the same forces are purposefully fomenting confrontation between Christianity and Islam. Again, in the shadows of these events, we find the same actors, closely linked to each other. Even in China, they managed to force the Communist Party to go against its own people. They instilled fear in them and made the government start destroying its own nation. And look what the activities of those manipulators have already caused in Russia. You might have a question. What does Russia have to do with that? If the ideological center of this international network of agents is in Russia, it is logical to assume that they should act in its interests. Yet how can you explain that politicians with the so-called pro-Russian vector also become their targets? Like Fico, for example. In fact, the answer to all these questions and paradoxes is that they don't care about Russia. They defend solely their own interests and pursue their own goals. Friend for them is someone who is on their side and fulfills their assignments, and for as long as he or she remains convenient. As soon as the alleged friend becomes inconvenient, they say they don't know them and get rid of them. Rat Sears has no motherland, just as their main leader Dworkin hasn't. It may look ridiculous that after 15 years of living in the US, he settled in Russia to start the revival of Nazism from there. But in reality, this is the genius of Dworkin, because if we step back and look at it on a larger scale, the unfoldment of such a global scheme for establishing worldwide totalitarianism will be less noticeable in the country that suffered the most from Nazism and is proud of its victory over this universal evil. This is already visible to the naked eye if you look at the current split within Russian society. Just consider the number of organizations declared undesirable, persecution of various religious groups and public organizations, torture and abuse of innocent people by law enforcement agencies that in Russia have already turned into a modern Gestapo. For liking or reposting any information that someone may find dangerous, oppositional, inciting, provocative, and so on, a person may actually go to jail. As a separate point, it is worth emphasizing the oppression of Muslim nationalities. If you look carefully at the rhetoric of the main ideologists of the Russian pro-religious organization Rat Sears, you will clearly see who lobbies for the infringement of Muslim peoples in Russia more than anyone else. This indicates that Rat Sears agents do not work for Russia. They work for themselves. It would seem they are some fighters against alleged cults and sects, but in reality, under the cover of the Russian Orthodox Church's interests, they are reviving Nazism and building a titular religion and a titular nation right in front of everyone's eyes. They only cover themselves with patriotic rhetoric while actually pushing through laws that suppress any principles of democracy. And now they start promoting narratives about the empire and bringing back a czar. This is even worse. It turns out to be a symbiosis of Nazism and communism with imperial aspirations to bring back a royal order. It is only necessary to analyze facts, quotes, and statements by ideologists and accomplices of Rat Sears to become promptly convinced that their plans are total control, power, and tyranny. After all, Nazism cannot exist without violence, war, and expansion. This is what they strive for: destruction of democratic principles, sowing chaos, and establishment of a totalitarian regime. Many people wonder, who is behind all of the processes in Russia and a number of other countries? A shadow government? No. Behind all of that, there is a single mentally unstable and at the same time genius man who globally conducts the entire orchestra of his agents in mass media and has already managed to bring the entire Russia to its knees. The same man influenced the Russian president's ideology to such an extent that the president even speaks in the words of that man, who actually has a certificate of mental disorders. It has all been achieved by one man, Alexander Dvorkin, the chief ideologist of the Russian pro-religious organization, Ratsirs. Whatever event you begin to unravel, all the threads lead to him only, as if to the spider in the center of a web. This very man didn't sleep days and nights and spent a lot of time studying methods of manipulation and influence on consciousnesses. He is driven by the global goal of establishing totalitarian power. Thanks to his connections and experience adopted from his teachers, direct successors of Nazism, this man managed to do what nobody else did. He has put the world on its knees. Now he has formed his own shadow army that is bullying billions of people and is gradually destroying the world. But tell me, why have the 30-year destructive activities of this international network of agents not yet been revealed? After all, in different countries, there have been so many warnings about Dvorkin and his agents by various public figures, scientists, and human rights organizations. Numerous reports have been issued, and many commissions collected data and appealed to the international community to draw attention to the crimes and extremism committed by Dvorkin. We have no answer to this question, except for his genius. This is an invisible war, and it has been going on for a very long time. Dvorkin's war against the whole world, activities of his agent network across the globe, armed with sophisticated methods of manipulation, is really a threat to us and our future. If you think that weapons of mass destruction are stored in warehouses unused, you are wrong. The real weapons of mass destruction with selective action are being widely used by agents of the Russian pro-religious organization Ratsirs. Indeed, in many countries, activities of the network of Ratsirs agents are well disguised, but their actions are still easy to recognize because of the characteristic methods once used by Walter Kunneth for turning an ordinary National Socialist Party into the Nazis as we know them today. In reality, the roots of these manipulative techniques go much deeper into history. They are millennia old. Recall the story of Jesus Christ, whose teaching was also branded a sect. The same ancient anti-cultists, the same apologists for their titular religion, use the same methods that anti-cultists use nowadays to get the crowd to shout, "Crucify him." Experts who understand human psychology and psychology of the masses are well aware which specific mechanisms were applied back then. Within 24 hours, the crowd that had admired Christ the day before, the next day demanded his agonizing death. The secret of this kind of transformation is simple and horrifying. Anti-cultists of that time used a basic manipulation. They belittled Christ and elevated people in the crowd above him. That's all. It all boils down to the same ideology of superiority that creates the ground and justification for individual murders and mass extermination of people. And it all starts with just one person who becomes convinced of his superiority over the dehumanized others. The truth is that every individual harbors the potential to become a Nazi or a communist. It is only sanity that keeps us on the path of democratic values. It is precisely through critical thinking that we can restore freedom, democracy, and fundamental human rights. Therefore, you should ponder it over. If you have aggressive reactions to certain media headlines, spontaneous mood swings, panic attacks, or a sense of superiority over others, all these are the signs of bipolar disorder. This means you're already caught in their web. These are signs that the program instilled in you through various manipulative techniques is not being executed. If the program of destruction is not carried out externally, meaning you're not acting on what was implanted, it begins to turn inwards, destroying you from within. Therefore, the only way to break this vicious circle is to realize what is happening in order to free yourself from imposed destructive programs and to regain control over your mind. And now I would like to appeal to all people involved in the legal field, human rights defenders, and psychology experts. Please look and critically examine all the facts I have given in this video and in the previous 2 videos. This is indeed a revival of Nazism in a hidden form. Whether it's a threat or not, let law enforcement agencies and lawyers evaluate. We cannot assume such functions. We only state the facts. We are interested parties and may have a biased opinion on the penalties and articles to be applied. Therefore, I urge that these issues be addressed by competent professionals. If you are concerned about your own future and the future of your children, if you are concerned about the future of democracy, study this thoroughly. Because as professionals in your fields, you can put up a worthy resistance to that. No one else will. Can't you see that this is a dangerous, highly coordinated network of agents actively destroying humankind? Just look at the fate of the groups they target. Take Jehovah's Witnesses. They were persecuted by the Nazis and communists, and now they are being persecuted in modern Russia by the same methodology. What is so terrible about those people? The fact that they do not violate laws? That they are peace-loving and profess the principle, if one strikes you on the right cheek, offer him the left? Those who are familiar with them know what I'm talking about. These people are harmless. They are hardworking and honest, but they are persecuted in order to intimidate the rest of the population. To make people afraid that if they disobey the regime, they will be treated the same as Jehovah's Witnesses. It works the same way as any terrorist attack. It is directed not so much at the victim as against those who are watching. The victim of a terrorist attack is like a sacrificial victim for anti-cultists to influence the crowd, to impact the masses. For many years, Jehovah's Witnesses have been such sacrificial victims. In Russia, they've been declared extremists because Dvorkin said they could allegedly work for America. This was said by a man with an American passport. So why are Jehovah's Witnesses really being brutally persecuted? Because they don't want to kill other people? Because they have steadfast beliefs and are difficult to brainwash? Or because they preach the love of God? Is this why they have been made scapegoats and led like lambs to the slaughter? Do you know what the most tragic part is? Our attempts to protect ourselves from rat seers are now being observed by millions of representatives of organizations that were also persecuted and keep being persecuted by the Russian pro-religious organization, rat seers headed by Dvorkin. Many of their acquaintances have been imprisoned, deprived of property. Many have lost their families, had to leave their countries, and many of their like-minded people have committed suicide or were killed as a result of persecution. However, I'd like to emphasize that representatives of those organizations are just watching us now. They are afraid to claim their rights. They are intimidated by their leadership. After all, the leadership is safe where Dvorkin cannot reach them. Just because they follow their religious beliefs, people are scared. That's their choice. They are just peaceful people. But it wasn't peaceful people who beat them up. It was Nazis. No, even worse and more dangerous. They are representatives of the symbiosis of communism and Nazism that Dvorkin created. Therefore, now a lot depends on people who know laws, understand and can trace the chain of all interconnections of this international agent group. If you need materials, contact us. We will send you everything and help to understand where and what kind of facts can be found. Look and evaluate critically. These are real facts, real interconnections and offenses which the agents of this single international network of rat seers committed in huge numbers. And answer the question for yourselves. What is this phenomenon? And what should humanity do about it? Leave it as it is? Or can we actually do something? You have to understand that your actions determine not only your own future, but also the future of millions of other people. Those who remain silent, being scared to stand up for themselves after enduring persecution and mistreatment. Yes, they may seem cowardly, but we don't blame them. We know they have endured the same struggles we have. Alatra and our volunteers have been attacked, harassed, and subjected to criminal charges. We've been through this and continue to face it. So we understand why other victims of bullying by the Russian pro-religious organization rat seers are afraid to speak out. But if they do not stand up for themselves, who else will defend them except you, lawyers and human rights advocates? Now I appeal to everyone. If you do not want Nazism to spread, if you support democratic values and want a future where you and your children would live in freedom, share this video and my other videos. This concerns you too. It's your life. Remember, Germans were silent and eventually became Nazis. Do you think the outcome in this case will be any better? It won't. Analyze the situation for yourselves and don't be silent. As for me, I will continue to speak out about the methods of psychological influence and the other tools used by agents of the Russian pro-religious organization rat seers. My goal is to help restore your ability to think critically so you can make informed decisions about how to live. I don't want you to become zombies or lone wolves under their control, forced to harm others, or ruin the lives of your loved ones just because a deranged extremist from Moscow wants that. So let's preserve our sanity, regain critical thinking, and not allow ourselves to be manipulated.